A racist woman thought stealing Big Shaq's motorcycle would be the ultimate rebellion. But what she didn't know, Big Shaq was controlling it remotely. Every turn, every break, every second. What started as a bold theft turned into a humiliating ride, live for the whole town to witness. This wasn't just a chase, it was a reckoning. And Big Shaq didn't need to say a word to change everything. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The sun stretched across the California sky like a golden ribbon, its warmth kissing the tops of palm trees, lining the sleepy suburban streets. Shaquille Big Shaq O'Neal eased his powerful frame onto the leather seat of his custom-built motorcycle, a gleaming black and chrome beast that rumbled to life beneath him. It wasn't just a machine, it was an extension of his soul, a symbol of freedom he'd cherished ever since his first taste of success. As he rolled down the street, kids waved from their front yards, mothers called greetings from porches, and even the grumpy old man who ran the hardware store gave him a nod. Shaq responded to each with a warmth that came effortlessly, his deep laugh carrying on the breeze. He was a giant not only in stature but in heart, and the community knew it. As Shaq turned onto Main Street, the heart of this small sun-dappled town, his presence became magnetic. Shopkeepers emerged from their storefronts, the baker wiping floury hands on his apron, the florist brushing petals from her sleeves, the mailman tipping his cap, all drawn to the quiet charisma of the man they affectionately called Big Shaq. To them, he wasn't the towering millionaire or the legend they saw on TV. He was the neighbor who remembered birthdays, who helped shovel sidewalks in the rare California frost, who once paid the vet bill for a stray dog the town adopted as its own. Shaq's life, so public on the surface, was a mosaic of small, generous acts most people never saw. Today, Shaq was feeling the need for solitude, not from loneliness, but for the quiet space where his thoughts roamed free. He pulled up to Java Junction, the local coffee shop, cutting the engine and resting his massive hands on the handlebars for a moment. The morning buzzed around him, the air thick with the smell of fresh coffee, pastries, and a whisper of sea salt drifting in from the coast. He drew a deep breath, savoring the calm. But then, from the corner of his eye, he noticed her. Across the street, leaning against a blue sedan that had seen better days, stood Danielle, slim, sharp-featured, arms folded across her chest like a barricade. She watched him with eyes narrowed into cold slits. Shaq had seen that look before, not just curiosity, but calculation. She had been hovering around town for weeks, her discontent growing like a shadow at sunset. Danielle wasn't from here. She had drifted in from a neighboring county, the kind of place where old resentments festered quietly, and the sight of a successful black man still stirred ugly feelings in certain hearts. Shaq turned away gently, not wanting to feed whatever storm Danielle carried inside. He stepped into the coffee shop exchanging pleasantries with the barista, a young man named Jason, whose smile brightened whenever Shaq walked in. Shaq placed his order, leaning casually against the counter, while outside the glass window, Danielle remained rooted in place, her gaze tightening as if she were trying to crush him with sheer force of will. Inside, the rhythm of the shop pulsed around Shaq like a familiar song. A group of teenagers clustered near the corner booth, their laughter mixing with the hiss of the espresso machine. An elderly couple, Martha and Bill, held hands at their usual table, quietly sipping their drinks, occasionally glancing at Shaq with fondness. Even here, in the smallest corners of life, Shaq moved like a lighthouse, steady, guiding, casting light, without asking for anything in return. But the atmosphere shifted outside. Danielle's fingers twitched at her side, her eyes darting between the motorcycle and the shop. The bike wasn't just a prize to her, it was a symbol, a statement she wanted to make. Shaq's success, his ease in a world she felt shut out from, grated against the sharp edges of her discontent. She saw his kindness as condescension, his wealth as unearned, his fame as a reminder of everything she didn't have. And now, that roaring black machine sat there, glimmering in the morning sun, like a challenge she was determined to meet. Shaq's phone buzzed gently in his pocket. He glanced down, seeing a message from his friend Ben, a tech guru, who had helped outfit the motorcycle with cutting-edge remote controls. A little experiment they'd been working on for months. All systems green, the message read. Shaq smiled faintly. It was just a hobby, a bit of harmless fun, but today it would become something more. As Shaq waited for his coffee, he could sense the shift outside without even turning his head. There was a pause in the flow of people on the street, a subtle ripple in the air. It was the kind of sixth sense he'd honed over years of navigating crowds. of reading rooms before he entered them. He knew Danielle was on the move. Outside, Danielle's breathing quickened as she approached the motorcycle. Her heart pounded with a cocktail of fear, adrenaline, and self-righteous anger. She swung a leg over the bike, her hands shaking as they gripped the handlebars. She had no plan, no destination, just the burning need to take, to own, to disrupt. The engine roared to life beneath her, the machine vibrating with raw power. She let out a shaky laugh, a sound half triumph, half dismay. Inside, Shaq's coffee arrived. He wrapped his hands around the cup, feeling the familiar weight, the comforting heat. He took one long sip, eyes drifting to the window just as the bike lurched away from the curb. There was no panic in his face, only a quiet, knowing amusement. He pulled out his phone, thumb hovering over the app that controlled every function of the bike: speed, brakes, direction, even the locks on the storage compartments. A masterpiece of engineering and trust, waiting for this very moment. As the motorcycle sped down Main Street, Danielle's laughter turned sharp, victorious, but only for a heartbeat. The bike twitched beneath her, as if possessed by a will of its own. A swerve here, a sudden acceleration there. Her joy flickered into confusion, then edged toward alarm. Shaq rose slowly, stretching his long frame, and tipped his head in a farewell nod to Jason. He stepped outside into the brilliant sunlight, the crowd beginning to stir with murmurs, eyes following the streaking bike. Shaq's hand rested lightly in his pocket, the phone resting against his palm like an ace in a card game, only he knew the rules too. And as the morning unfolded, golden and trembling with possibility, the first threads of an extraordinary, unexpected story began to weave themselves across the town. A tale of anger, of grace, and of a lesson no one, least of all Danielle, saw coming. Danielle leaned against her battered blue sedan, the California sun sharp on her pale skin, but she hardly noticed. Her arms were folded tight, fingers digging into her elbows as if to anchor herself against the growing storm inside. Her eyes, sharp and cold, stayed locked on Shaq as he moved through the crowd with that easy, grounded grace. She watched the way people greeted him. The shopkeeper's laugh, the kid's high five, the old woman's soft smile, and each gesture burned through her like acid. Danielle's jaw clenched so tightly it ached, the enamel of her back teeth grinding under the weight of a resentment she'd nursed for years. In her mind, it wasn't just Shaq standing there. It was every symbol of a world she believed had overlooked her, passed her by, and somehow conspired to leave her stranded on the sidelines. A black man with millions, fame, love from a town that barely knew her name. It gnawed at her, twisted in her gut until it became something sharp, something dangerous. She told herself stories to stoke the fire, that he didn't earn this, that he was given it, that people like her, people who'd scraped by, been ignored, worked jobs they hated, were the real backbone of the world. And yet here he was, basking in adoration, while she stood on the curb, invisible, seething. She glanced at the motorcycle. It was a marvel, all polished chrome and muscle, the kind of machine that turned heads before the engine even coughed to life. Danielle's fingers twitched, her mind whirling with the same bitter refrain. He doesn't deserve that. The thought looped, louder each time, until it drowned out the hum of the town around her. She didn't see the kids racing down the sidewalk, or the mother pushing a stroller, or the elderly couple lingering in the sun. She saw only the bike, the man, and the gaping hole of her own dissatisfaction. Inside the coffee shop, Shaq ordered his drink, laughing softly with the barista. Danielle's eyes narrowed to slits. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears as her feet moved before her mind caught up. Each step toward the bike felt charged, reckless, and yet perfectly inevitable. She was done watching. She was done swallowing her anger. She was going to make a statement. As her hand wrapped around the cool grip of the handlebar, a strange electricity shot through her veins. Fear. Yes, but also exhilaration. The bike came alive with a deep, throaty rumble that vibrated up her arms, filling her chest with a rush of power she hadn't felt in years. For one brief moment, Danielle felt like the world was in her hands, like she was the one people would notice, the one they'd talk about. She swung her leg over, fingers fumbling awkwardly at first, but the engine growled beneath her as if welcoming her rebellion. With a yank of the throttle, she shot forward, the back tire spitting up dust as she tore down Main Street. Inside the coffee shop, Shaq turned casually, his coffee steaming between his fingers. His dark eyes followed the streak of motion outside the window, the corner of his mouth lifting in something that wasn't quite surprise. He took another slow sip, then slipped his phone from his pocket, the control app already glowing on the screen. Ben's name flashed in his texts. The message simple: "She's all yours, big man." Shaq shook his head with a soft chuckle, tapping the screen with the calm of a man who had no need to rush. Danielle's heart raced as she leaned into the wind, the houses and trees blurring at the edges of her vision. She felt the burn of freedom in her chest, a laugh clawing its way up her throat, jagged and wild. But within seconds, the first shift came. Subtle, almost imperceptible. The throttle resisted her pull just slightly, the bike's response tightening like a leash drawing back. She frowned, twisting harder, but the machine only gave her a teasing flicker of speed, before easing into a glide she hadn't commanded. Panic flared in Danielle's gut. She jerked the handlebars, but the bike stayed smooth, unnervingly smooth, as if it had developed its own will. She felt the first trickle of sweat down her neck, the exhilaration bleeding into confusion. Behind her, the coffee shop faded, but the weight of Shaq's quiet presence didn't. In her mind, she could still see his calm face, the way his eyes had followed her, unshaken, almost amused. Shaq stepped outside, the sun casting a soft halo around his tall frame. His fingers danced lightly across the app, tapping commands as casually as if he were changing a playlist. On his screen, telemetry flickered. Speed, tilt, braking, all under his control. He had worked with Ben for months, fine-tuning this project, not for theft prevention, but for fun, for the challenge of fusing machine and man. He never expected it to become a lesson in grace. Down the street, Danielle's pulse thundered. She gritted her teeth, yanking again at the handlebars, as the bike weaved just out of her control. A slow swerve to the left, then the right, a teasing dance that turned her ride into something foreign, unnerving. Her mind raced with curses, her cheeks flushed red with humiliation. She slammed her heel into the ground, trying to stop, but the bike resisted, steady as a heartbeat. Fear bloomed behind her ribs, sharp and cold, crawling up her spine like a whisper she couldn't shake. "You're not in charge." The town stirred to life around the spectacle. People stepped out of shops, phones raised, murmurs rising like waves along the sidewalks. Shaq watched from the curb, his broad shoulders relaxed, his face thoughtful. He wasn't angry, he felt the old ache instead, the bone-deep weariness of a man who had carried the weight of prejudice too long to be surprised by it. Danielle wasn't just a thief. She was a mirror reflecting back the bitter undercurrent that still ran through too many places, too many hearts. For Danielle, each block became a battlefield. She fought the bike as if it were a living thing, muscles straining, curses tumbling from her lips. But beneath the panic, something older stirred, a quiet, gnawing voice whispering that maybe, just maybe, the problem wasn't the machine, or the man who owned it, but the gnarl of resentment she had carried for years. Still, pride dug its heels in. She refused to surrender, not yet. Shaq's fingers hovered over one last control, the brakes, but he paused. Not yet. He wanted to see if the moment might unfold into something more. As the sun climbed higher, casting long golden streaks across the road, the town held its breath, watching a man who refused to meet anger with anger, and a woman riding straight toward the limits of her own rage. Shaq stepped out into the bright California sun, a quiet smile tugging at the corners of his mouth, as the distant rumble of the stolen motorcycle faded into the soundscape of Main Street. The town behind him buzzed in confusion and curiosity, but Shaq's heartbeat stayed calm, steady as a drum. He slid a massive thumb across the screen of his phone, opening the custom app that Ben had designed, the soft glow of the interface reflecting in his sunglasses. With a slight tap, he brought the telemetry panel to life, watching in real time as the bike's speed and angle registered on the graph. To anyone else, this might have been a moment of rage or revenge, but to Shaq it was something far more profound, a test of patience, a quiet dance between two people locked in a chase, neither fully understood yet. Out on the highway, the world blurred into streaks of green and gold as Danielle leaned into the wind, her heart pounding in her chest. The joy of the theft had filled her like a spark catching dry leaves, hot, bright, consuming, but it was burning out faster than she expected. The bike beneath her, a mechanical beast she had imagined as an obedient prize, was starting to buck against her control. The throttle, once smooth under her palm, jerked without warning, a twitchy surge forward that nearly lifted her off the seat. Danielle's mouth went dry, as the first crackle of fear rippled through her stomach, replacing the fierce triumph she'd felt only moments before. Shaq watched the data stream shift, the bike accelerating slightly, then easing back, the telltale signs of a rider losing her grip. He could have shut it down right then, pulled the plug, and ended the chase with one press of his finger. But something in him hesitated. He wasn't here to punish, he was here to reveal. That was what Lucille, his mother, had taught him all those years ago. When people try to tear you down, you don't meet them on their level, you rise above, and in doing so you force them to confront their own reflection. Danielle gritted her teeth, eyes wide as the bike cut to the left with a suddenness that sent a scream ripping up her throat, only to straighten a second later with eerie precision. Cars honked as they sped past, their drivers startled by the erratic machine slicing through the lanes. She yanked the handlebars, trying to rein the beast back under her command, but it danced just out of reach, a predator toying with its prey. Her breath came in sharp, ragged bursts, her chest tightening as the cold blade of panic slid deeper into her ribs. What had felt like power minutes ago now felt like a trap. Shaq took a slow breath, fingers moving smoothly over the app as he guided the motorcycle away from danger, keeping Danielle just clear of real harm. He eased her through traffic, controlled the sharp curves, softened the edges of the chaos she had unleashed. He could see it all in his mind's eye, the panic in her fingers, the sweat on her brow, the tightening of her jaw as fear wrestled with pride inside her. Yet his face remained calm, a gentle patience etched into every line, the stillness of a man who understood that sometimes the best way to dismantle hatred was to let it run its course, until it hit its own wall. On the open stretch of the highway, Danielle spotted a chance, a wide shoulder bathed in sunlight, an escape route shimmering like a mirage. She threw her weight to the side, trying to guide the bike off the main road, but the handlebars locked with a quiet stubbornness, refusing to yield. A cry of frustration burst from her lips, a wild, feral sound that twisted into a half-sob before she could choke it back. Inside, the tangled knot of her rage and shame tightened. How could this be happening? How could she, the one seizing control, be the one caged? In his mind, Shaq spoke to her, though she couldn't hear him. He imagined telling her about the nights he'd sat in his car outside games, collecting himself after hearing slurs from the stands, or the mornings when he had swallowed his own frustration so his children wouldn't see the world's ugliness reflected in his eyes. He wanted her to know that power wasn't about domination, but restraint, about knowing you could strike back, but choosing instead to teach, to hold up a mirror until the truth became too heavy to deny. Danielle's fingers cramped around the grips, her body shaking as the bike played its slow, measured game. She could feel the eyes on her, the drivers glancing from their windows, the passengers pointing, the phone cameras capturing every jolt and swerve. Somewhere in the back of her mind, a tiny voice began to whisper doubts, threading its way through the fury. What if this wasn't a lucky theft gone wrong? What if she was being played? What if the man she had mocked as soft and harmless was the one holding all the strings? As if in answer, the bike slowed, coasting gently along the side of the road, a hush falling over the engine like a long exhale. Danielle blinked, momentarily stunned, heart hammering in the sudden quiet. Her arms trembled from the strain, her mouth parched, her eyes prickling with the sting of unshed tears. For a moment, all she could hear was the blood rushing in her ears, the echo of her own breath, the dawning realization that she was no longer the author of this story. Shaq stood at the edge of a small overlook, the highway cutting a ribbon across the valley below, his phone cradled in his hand like a prayer bead. The data showed her slowing, pausing, hovering on the brink of surrender. He watched with quiet gravity, knowing this was the moment where something inside her might break open, where the weight of her own choices might finally press down hard enough to crack the surface. And still, no gloating touched his face, only a deep, aching hope that the woman on the bike might see herself clearly for the first time. Danielle took one shuddering breath, eyes sweeping the horizon, the realization blooming sharp and bright. She had been the one spinning out all along. Not the bike, not the man. She squeezed her eyes shut, the tears pushing past her defenses at last, and for a heartbeat the fierce, snarling pride she'd clung to like armor slipped from her shoulders. And as the wind settled over the highway, and the sun dipped just a little lower in the sky, Shaq waited, calm, patient, the silent witness to a reckoning unfolding, 1 mile at a time. In the heart of the town, Main Street crackled with an energy that no one had expected on a sleepy afternoon. What had begun as a quiet coffee run for Shaq had rippled outward like a dropped stone in a still pond, sending waves through every corner of the community. Within minutes, people began to gather in clusters on sidewalks and outside storefronts, their phones raised high as the live-streamed footage of the rogue motorcycle shot across social media feeds. The images were shaky, hurried, a flash of Danielle's panicked face, the streak of the black and chrome bike weaving along the highway, the occasional glimpse of Shaq standing calmly on the curb, his fingers resting on the phone that seemed to control it all. Inside Marcy's diner, the lunchtime crowd abandoned their burgers and fries to crowd around the television bolted in the corner, where a local news anchor scrambled to narrate the unfolding drama. Marcy herself, a stout woman with a voice like gravel and a heart of gold, kept one hand pressed to her chest, murmuring, "Lord Shaq, what in the world are you doing?" Her regulars, a mix of construction workers and office clerks, offered their running commentary, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others marveling at Shaq's patience, still others muttering about Danielle and the trouble she'd dragged onto their quiet street. Outside, at the corner barber shop, chairs stood empty as men gathered under the striped awning, squinting at their phones. "You see that?" one of them whispered. "Shaq's not even breaking a sweat. Man's got nerves of steel." Another grunted, arms folded across his chest. "Girl's asking for it. You don't pull a stunt like that on Big Shaq and think you're walking away clean." But amid the tough talk there was a tension in their eyes, a thread of suspense winding tighter as they waited to see what Shaq would do. Not with force, not with anger, but with that unshakable calm that had come to define him in this town. At the far end of town, in a modest kitchen filled with the smell of baking bread, Lucille O'Neill stood by the window, watching the sunlight dance across her garden. The television in the corner murmured with live updates, but Lucille barely glanced at it. Her hands, weathered and strong, rested on the edge of the sink. As she gazed out, her reflection faint in the glass. Worry touched her brow, but it was softened by a deeper, steadier trust. Trust in her son, in the lessons she had poured into him from the time his feet were barely steady on the ground. She could hear the voices outside, neighbors gathering on sidewalks, voices rising in anxious curiosity, but Lucille remained still, whispering under her breath, "Stay kind, baby. Stay true." Not far away, in a quiet home framed by ivy and roses, Shawnee Henderson watched the scene unfold on her tablet, her fingers curling thoughtfully under her chin. She had known Shaq long enough to predict the rhythms of his heart, to understand the way he absorbed the world's blows without letting them harden him. As the footage flickered across the screen, Danielle's wild ride, Shaq's steady silhouette, Shawnee felt a mix of admiration and ache. She had seen him navigate fame, loss, heartbreak, and prejudice, had watched him carry burdens that would have crushed lesser men, and still, here he was, responding to a theft and a public humiliation, with patience instead of fury, with strategy instead of vengeance. She smiled softly to herself, murmuring, "That's why they'll never break you." At the town square where families often gathered for festivals and concerts, the crowd was swelling. Teenagers clustered in excited knots, refreshing their social media feeds every few seconds, while parents kept one cautious eye on their children and the other on the unfolding spectacle. "He's just toying with her now," one teen said, shaking his head. "He could shut that bike down any time." But a woman nearby, cradling a toddler on her hip, answered quietly, "No, he's not toying, he's teaching." The words hung in the air, settling into the collective hum of the crowd, as they waited breath held for whatever would come next. Across town, in the newsroom of the local paper, reporters scrambled to update their website, phones buzzing with calls from regional outlets. The editor, a wiry man named Franklin, tapped furiously at his keyboard, muttering, "This is going national by sundown." But even as he fed the frenzy, a flicker of something softer stirred beneath his professional detachment, a curiosity about the human moment unfolding beneath the viral headlines, a wonder at what it meant to watch a man face public betrayal and still choose grace. On the highway, the bike streaked along, its rider visibly faltering as the machine resisted her every command. Danielle's knuckles blanched white against the grips, her eyes darting wildly, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She was no longer a thief on a joyride. She was a woman cornered by forces she hadn't anticipated, watched by eyes she couldn't escape. The town's gaze was no longer just local. It had become a collective mirror reflecting back her own unraveling. And though she couldn't hear it, though she couldn't feel its weight directly, the pull of that collective expectation, that gathering chorus of suspense and judgment, was closing in. Back in town, Lucille turned from the window, crossing the kitchen with slow, measured steps. She reached for the radio, turning the dial until an old gospel tune filled the room, the soft notes weaving through the charged air. Her fingers traced the rim of a framed photo on the shelf, Shaq as a boy, beaming at the camera, his arms wrapped around a basketball half his size. Her heart ached with the knowledge that no matter how far he'd come, some lessons still waited at every turn. Some trials still rose up to test his spirit. But Lucille smiled through the ache, whispering to the silent room, "You've got this." Shawnee, watching from her living room, set her tablet aside and leaned back against the cushions, her mind drifting through memories, the long conversations, the quiet confessions, the moments when Shaq had laid bare his exhaustion at always having to be the better man. And yet here he was again, choosing restraint, choosing empathy. She felt a swell of pride and sorrow mingling in her chest, a bittersweet mix that only deepened her admiration for him. As the sun dipped lower and the long shadows of evening crept across the town, the community leaned in, bound together by a tension that had little to do with a stolen motorcycle and everything to do with the unfolding test of character. They waited not just to see if Shaq would stop Danielle, but to see whether patience, grace, and unshakable calm could carry the day in a world so accustomed to swift retribution. And so, as the roar of the highway echoed faintly in the distance, the town held its breath, eyes wide, hearts braced, watching a man they admired not for his size or his fame, but for the quiet, unwavering strength that no machine, no thief, no wave of prejudice could ever take away. The wind whipped Danielle's hair across her face as she clung desperately to the handlebars, her fingers stiff and aching, her jaw clenched so tight it felt like her teeth might crack. What had started as a rush of rebellion had soured into pure panic, her breath catching in sharp, ragged bursts as the motorcycle beneath her refused to obey. The highway stretched out endlessly, the world blurring past her in flashes of green and gray, and with each mile, her fear curdled into something darker. "Damn you, Shaq." Danielle spat under her breath, her voice shaking with fury as she leaned forward, yanking at the throttle. But the bike only laughed at her struggle, slowing just enough to taunt her before easing back into a controlled glide. She hurled curses into the wind, her voice raw and cracking, as if the sheer force of her anger could break the machine's hold. "You think you're better than me? You think you can just control everything?" Her words dissolved into a frustrated scream, one swallowed whole by the roar of the engine and the rush of passing cars. Behind her, a caravan of onlookers gathered in slow pursuit, some in their cars, phones pressed to dashboards, live streaming the strange spectacle. Others parked along the highway shoulder, watching with wary eyes, as the woman on the stolen bike hurled herself against forces she couldn't understand. And yet in the midst of it all, Shaq stood apart. Far from the noise and the spectacle, he remained a calm anchor, fingers resting lightly on the control app, his eyes heavy with thought, not vengeance. In his chest, Shaq felt the familiar ache, that low, gnawing pain that had haunted him through years of headlines and locker rooms, interviews and stares. The ache of knowing that no matter how kind, how generous, how steadfast he tried to be, there would always be someone ready to see him as less, to resent his success, to turn his presence into a target. It was an ache his mother, Lucille, had warned him about, and one Shawnee had often softened with quiet words at his side. But today, the weight settled deeper as he watched Danielle spiral into rage, as her hate poured out not just at the bike but at him, at the idea of him, at everything she had convinced herself he stood for. On the highway, Danielle's mind fractured into jagged, searing flashes, images of unpaid bills stacked on the kitchen counter, of a father who walked out when she was 9, of a string of jobs that went nowhere, of promotions handed to others, of smiles exchanged across rooms she never entered. The bitterness she'd carried for years cracked wide open, spilling into her throat, until it choked her. She shouted into the air, a wild sound, half laugh, half sob, as the realization clawed at her chest that she was no longer in control, that she had never really been in control, and that the man she had tried to humiliate had instead become the silent architect of her reckoning. Shaq took a slow breath, feeling the soft buzz of the phone in his hand, as notifications poured in. Text from Ben, from Shawnee, from old teammates, from reporters. But he ignored them all. His focus stayed fixed on the woman, riding the edge of her fury, on the delicate line between her unraveling and her awakening. He could stop it now, end the ride, call the police, press charges. But that was never his plan. This wasn't about payback. It was about showing her something no courtroom or punishment could deliver. A confrontation with herself, the truth of her own broken story, laid bare in the wind. Danielle's legs ached, her thighs trembling as she tried again to slow the bike, to pull off onto the shoulder, to abandon this nightmare before it swallowed her whole. But the machine wouldn't yield, gliding forward as if led by an unseen hand. "Let me off. Let me go," she screamed, pounding her fists against the grips, her voice cracking under the weight of her panic. But the road gave no answer. The bike's hum steady and calm, a cruel counterpoint to the chaos unraveling inside her. Her mind spun backward, dragging her into memories she had buried deep. She saw herself at 16, watching from the window as neighbors crowded around a family down the street that had just moved in. A black family, their laughter spilling into the night, their presence lighting up the block in a way Danielle had never managed. She had watched her parents mutter under their breath, watched the polite smiles that tightened when certain people walked into the room, absorbed the lesson without it ever being spoken outright. And over the years, the silent bitterness had ripened into something sharper, something uglier, until it no longer needed a reason to rise. It only needed a target. Shaq, feeling the pulse of the bike through his app, adjusted its speed, drawing it gently toward a stretch of road that curved along the coastline, the ocean shimmering just beyond the guardrails. His heart stayed steady, but inside, sorrow stirred. Sorrow for all the moments in his life when kindness had been met with suspicion, when patience had been mistaken for weakness, when success had been framed as an affront. And yet he knew, he had always known, that grace was the only answer he could live with, the only response that turned the weight of hate into something that could teach, that could shift a heart even 1 inch toward the light. Danielle's breath hitched as the bike slowed again, gliding toward a turnout that opened onto a breathtaking view of the sea. The salt air filled her lungs, sharp and cold, cutting through the haze of her rage just enough to make her falter. For a heartbeat she stopped struggling, her shoulders sagging under the weight of her exhaustion, her fingers loosening on the grips as tears blurred her vision. In the stillness, she felt the ghost of her younger self rise up, the girl who had wanted more, who had wanted to be seen, to matter, to win just once. And for the first time in years, Danielle wondered if all the anger she had poured into the world had done anything but chain her to her own loneliness. Far in the distance, Shaq watched, his breath slow, his eyes soft with a sadness too old to surprise him anymore. He felt the moment balancing on a knife's edge, the choice still hers, still trembling in the space between fury and surrender. And as the last light of day kissed the edge of the horizon, Shaq whispered under his breath, not a prayer but a quiet hope, that this woman, this stranger who had tried to strip him of dignity, might find her own before the road ended. The old county bridge stretched out before Danielle like a relic from another time, its rusted iron beams catching the last light of day in a bruised copper glow. The motorcycle's engine, once a roaring beast beneath her, now softened to a low, purring hum as it rolled onto the bridge, gliding with eerie smoothness. Danielle's arms shook as she clutched the handlebars, her chest tight with exhaustion and fury. She had been fighting the machine, the road, the humiliating loss of control for what felt like an eternity, but as the bridge loomed closer, the bike's speed dropped without her command. Her eyes darted wildly, heart leaping, as she felt the first tremble of real panic, not the frantic, angry kind, but the cold, creeping realization that the ride was ending, and she wasn't prepared for what came next. With a soft, almost elegant roll, the bike coasted to a stop at the center of the bridge. Danielle wasted no time. She swung her leg off with a graceless scramble, her boots scraping against the pavement as she stumbled away from the bike like it was a live wire. Her breath came in ragged gulps, her hair plastered to her face with sweat, her body vibrating from head to toe with the aftershocks of adrenaline. She whipped around to face the motorcycle, fists clenched, chest heaving, fury spilling out in a raw, hoarse scream. "Enough, you hear me? Enough!" Danielle shouted, her voice cracking in the still air. She took a staggering step forward, ready to hurl her final act of defiance, but the sight of the bike froze her mid-stride. The compartments had closed, her purse, her phone, her keys, all locked away. A strangled laugh broke from her lips, wild and brittle, as she slapped her hands against her thighs. "You've got to be kidding me," she yelled at the silent machine, spinning in a circle as if the sky itself would answer. But it wasn't the sky that answered. Shaq's voice poured from the bike's hidden speakers, deep and calm, threaded with a warmth that cut across the cold chasm between them. "Danielle," he said, her name soft like a greeting, not a reprimand. "You've been running a long time. You tired yet?" Danielle stumbled backward, eyes wide, as if the bike had grown a mouth and spoken. "Oh, hell no," she hissed under her breath, shaking her head in disbelief. No, no, no. You don't get to play wise man on me now. But the voice continued, steady and patient, untouched by her rage. I know you're angry, Shaq said gently. I know you feel cheated, like the world's got its knee on your back, and nobody's ever stopped to see you. I can't tell you you're wrong. But what you did today, that wasn't about me. That was you wrestling with something you've been carrying for a long time. Danielle's lips pulled into a sneer, the sharp, defensive kind that masks a heart flinching underneath. Spare me the sermon, she muttered, pacing in tight circles, her boots striking sharp echoes on the old bridge, but her arms wrapped tighter across her chest, and the trembling in her fingers betrayed her tough exterior. She felt stripped bare, as if Shaq's voice had peeled back the layers she'd used to armor herself. Anger, bitterness, resentment, leaving her raw and exposed on a bridge that suddenly felt too quiet, too still. The sun dipped lower, painting the river below in streaks of gold and blood red, and for a heartbeat, Danielle saw herself reflected in the water's restless surface, a woman panting, disheveled, lost in a moment that should never have been hers. And beneath the spike of her anger, something else stirred, the sharp sting of shame. Shaq's voice softened even further, slipping into that low, steady cadence that had comforted teammates in locker rooms, friends on their worst days, even strangers who had crossed his path at just the right moment. Danielle, he said again, you've been carrying a weight so long you forgot it was never yours to hold. All that anger, that doesn't have to be your story. Danielle's knees buckled slightly, and she caught herself on the metal rail, her breath sharp as a blade in her throat. Why are you doing this? She whispered to no one, to the river, to the sky, to the man whose voice wrapped around her like a quiet, unyielding presence. Why don't you just call the cops? Have me dragged off? Humiliate me in front of everyone? For a long stretched second, there was only the sound of the river below, and the faint creak of the bridge under the weight of old steel. Then Shaq's voice came, slow and clear. Because that's not the lesson you need, and it's not the man I want to be. The words sliced through Danielle's defenses like a hot blade through ice. She felt her throat tighten, her eyes sting, her hands clenching and unclenching at her sides as the facade she had clung to for so long began to crack. The woman who had leapt onto that bike full of fire and fury was slipping through her hearers, leaving behind someone she hadn't met in years, a woman who was scared, small, and suddenly uncertain of who she was without her anger to shield her. Across town, people huddled around screens and radios, the live feed still rolling from a shaky cell phone camera down the road. The crowd murmured in disbelief as Shaq's voice came through, not with threats or rage, but with the quiet, unwavering patience that had always been his trademark. In living rooms, diners, barbershops, the town held its collective breath, hearts twisting as they watched the unexpected unfold. On the bridge, Danielle let out a ragged exhale, her shoulders slumping as her knees finally gave out, folding her onto the cold pavement. She buried her face in her hands, the weight of her choices crashing down like a tidal wave. And still, Shaq stayed with her, his voice a tether pulling her back from the edge. You're not the first person to come at me with hate, Shaq said quietly. You won't be the last, but today you get to choose how this ends. Danielle sat trembling, the river whispering below, the sun sinking toward the horizon. She realized, with a hollow ache in her chest, that she didn't have an answer. And for the first time in a very long time, she let herself sit in that silence, letting the lesson settle in her bones. On the other end of the connection, Shaq closed his eyes briefly, feeling the burden of the moment lift just enough for him to breathe. It wasn't about winning. It was never about winning. It was about offering a door, however small, and praying the person on the other side would have the courage to step through. By the time the sun dipped behind the hills, the bridge had become the town's heartbeat, pulsing with the buzz of voices, flashing cameras, and the soft stir of nervous anticipation. Cars lined the road as far as the eye could see, headlights casting long beams that stretched like fingers toward the gathering crowd. News vans rumbled into place, their antennas rising like steel spires against the darkening sky. Reporters fixed their hair, adjusted their microphones, and rehearsed sound bites, eager to seize a story that had exploded across social media feeds and now demanded a front-row seat. The townspeople came in waves, some curious, others anxious, a few murmuring quiet prayers under their breath. Children perched on their parents' shoulders, straining to catch a glimpse of the woman at the center of it all. Teenagers live-streamed the scene with trembling hands, their feeds already flooded with emojis, comments, and hashtags. Big Shaq, Bridge Reckoning, Grace over Hate, The air vibrated with a tension no one knew how to name. Part spectacle, part confession, part collective reckoning. Near the edge of the crowd, Shaq's children stood close, their faces drawn with worry and quiet strength. Mira, tall and poised, her dark eyes shadowed by concern, held her arms crossed tight against her chest. She glanced once at her father, watching his familiar profile, the calm set of his shoulders, the easy, unshaken way he stood despite the noise and chaos. She knew that look. It was the same look he wore when cameras crowded too close after losses on the court, when headlines twisted his words, when strangers made him a symbol instead of a man. She knew tonight wasn't just about a stolen motorcycle. It was about all the moments like this that had come before. On the bridge, Danielle shifted unsteadily on her feet, her face pale, her fingers trembling as she tried to compose herself. The shouts of the crowd swirled around her, some angry, some mocking, some simply fascinated. Snippets of her rants, caught on dozens of live streams, were already playing on loops in the hands of onlookers. Danielle heard herself in those clips, the slurs, the venom, the ugly hiss of resentment, and each word landed like a slap against her own skin. For the first time in years, she wanted to disappear, to slip between the cracks of the pavement and vanish before anyone could see her crumble. But they were all watching. And Shaq, most of all. Shaq stepped forward, his large frame moving with the kind of effortless grace that turned heads without trying. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't wave his arms or command the crowd like a man hungry for a spotlight. Instead, he lifted one hand, just one, and the murmuring voices softened to a hush. The reporters leaned in, their cameras trained on his face, their microphones eager for outrage. But what came was something they hadn't prepared for. Shaq's voice, deep and even, rolled across the crowd like a balm. "I know some of you came here tonight, expecting a show," he said, his eyes sweeping over the sea of faces, pausing briefly on Danielle, whose arms were wrapped around herself like armor. "Maybe you expected anger, maybe you expected punishment, maybe you expected me to stand here and tell you how it feels to have someone look at you and only see a target." A ripple ran through the crowd, a shifting of feet, a clearing of throats, a few glances downward as the weight of his words sank in. "I've been dealing with that feeling a long time," Shaq continued. "Long before there were cameras, before there was money, before there were headlines. And I'll be honest with you. I'm tired of proving I belong, tired of proving I'm human, tired of proving that grace isn't weakness. But here's what I've learned. If I let that tiredness turn into bitterness, if I let it shape me into something small, then I lose. We all lose." Danielle's breath hitched, her eyes stinging as she squeezed them shut, willing the tears to stay buried. But the sound of Shaq's voice, patient, unyielding, impossibly kind, slipped through the cracks in her defenses, finding the places she hadn't known were breakable. Shaq shifted his gaze to her, his expression steady but never cruel. "Danielle," he said softly, and the crowd instinctively leaned in. "Tonight, you have a choice. You can hold on to the hate that brought you here, or you can set it down. You can face the pain that twisted your anger into something you thought was power, or you can keep carrying it until it eats you alive." Danielle felt her knees buckle slightly, her fingers clutching at the sleeves of her jacket, her chest tight with the weight of her own collapse. Around her the crowd blurred, their voices fading into a hum as her focus narrowed to the man standing a few feet away, refusing to crush her even when every reason was his. Mara's throat tightened as she watched her father speak. She felt her heart swell with something she could only name as awe. Not the awe of a famous man commanding a crowd, but the awe of watching someone take the ugliest parts of the world and meet them with a strength that didn't need to shout. She glanced at her siblings, saw their shared expression of quiet pride, and felt the tug of tears behind her eyes. Shaq took one slow step forward, his voice softening further, as if the crowd had melted away and only Danielle remained. "You tried to humiliate me today," he said, "but I want you to understand something. You can't take from me what I refuse to give away. My dignity, my peace, my ability to forgive, those are mine, and tonight, I'm choosing to keep them." Danielle let out a shaky exhale, her chest hitching as the tears she'd fought all night finally spilled over. Her shoulders sagged, as the rage that had carried her this far drained away, leaving only the hollow ache of someone lost in the wake of her own worst decisions. She raised her hands slightly, then dropped them, her mouth trembling as she searched for words that wouldn't come. The crowd remained hushed, the moment heavy with a silence that felt almost sacred. For one suspended breath, The town stood still, not because a man had been wronged, but because a man had chosen, in front of everyone, to show what it looked like to carry the weight of injustice without letting it crush his spirit. Shaq turned slightly, glancing back at his children, then at the faces lining the bridge. "We all have work to do," he said quietly. "Tonight, let's start by remembering we're more than our worst moments." The applause when it came was not a roar but a ripple. Soft at first, then growing, rolling over the bridge in waves of relief and release. Danielle wept quietly, her legs giving out as she sank to the pavement, the last defenses slipping away as the crowd watched, not with scorn but with something closer to understanding. And through it all, Shaq remained still, the quiet center of a storm he had calmed without ever raising his voice. The bridge was nearly empty now, the crowd having drifted back toward their cars and homes, leaving behind a hush that clung to the twilight like a second skin. The air hung heavy with the scent of salt and old steel, the last colors of the sunset bleeding across the river's surface. Danielle stood alone near the railing, her shoulders curled inward, arms folded tight across her chest, as if she could hold herself together by sheer will. The echo of her own ragged breath filled the space between the quiet murmur of onlookers and the steady hum of Shaq's motorcycle, still resting calmly in the middle of the bridge. For the first time all night, Danielle wasn't running, yelling, or deflecting. She was still, raw, stripped bare by her own choices. The fight gone from her limbs. She stared down at the water below, watching the shifting reflection of the sky, and wondered how she had ended up here, in this moment, with the man she had tried to humiliate, offering her a kind of mercy she could neither understand nor deserve. Her fists tightened, nails digging into her palms, as her mind swirled with the wreckage of the night. The thrill of the theft, the panic as the bike betrayed her, the sharp sting of public disgrace, and finally, Shaq's words, not sharp, not cruel, but so piercingly gentle they had cleaved right through her anger. Shaq approached slowly, his footsteps a low, steady rhythm on the pavement. He carried no triumph in his gait, no trace of gloating in his face. His massive frame moved with a softness that seemed almost impossible for a man of his size, his presence less an intrusion, and more an invitation. He stopped a few feet away, one hand resting lightly on the bike's seat, the other hanging at his side. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching between them like a thin, trembling thread. Finally, Shaq tilted his head, his voice low but steady. "You ready to go home, Danielle?" The words hung there, suspended in the heavy air. Danielle's chest tightened, her breath catching on a sharp, invisible hook. She wanted to lash out, to spit something biting, to hurl back a refusal that would preserve at least a shred of her pride. But the fight inside her had dimmed to a faint, flickering ember, and what remained was something smaller, something cracked wide open. Her mouth opened, then closed, then opened again, but no words came. Instead, a single sob burst from her throat, raw and unplanned, and she crumpled forward, hands flying to her face as her body shuddered with the weight of her own collapse. Shaq didn't move, didn't rush forward or fill the space with noise. He waited, the way he had waited through the entire ordeal, his patience a quiet force that reshaped the moment without a single raised hand or sharp word. Danielle's shoulders shook as the tears came hard and fast, the dam finally broken, her knees threatening to buckle as years of bitterness, shame and exhaustion spilled out in one unrelenting flood. Around them the crowd watched from a respectful distance, the earlier tension replaced with a thick humming curiosity. Phones hovered at lowered angles, whispers rippled through the gathered townspeople, and children peeked out from behind parents' legs, sensing instinctively that something important was unfolding. Shawnee stood off to the side, one arm around Mora's shoulders, her eyes glistening with the kind of pride that could only come from witnessing grace in action. Lucille, standing near the front, murmured a quiet prayer under her breath, her weathered hands clasped tightly as she watched her son bridge a chasm no one else had dared to cross. When Danielle's sobs finally softened, Shaq crouched slightly, his voice warm but firm. "You can walk away," he said, his tone without judgment, "or you can ride back with me." He gestured gently to the bike, the same machine she had tried to steal, the same machine that had carried her through her unraveling. "It's your choice." Danielle lifted her head, her face blotchy and wet, her breath hitching as she looked at the motorcycle, then at Shaq, then back at the ground. The battle inside her played out in every twitch of her fingers, every flicker in her eyes, every shudder in her shoulders. For a second it seemed she might bolt, hurl one last insult, reclaim whatever shards of defiance she could salvage. But then, with a small trembling exhale, she gave the faintest nod. The shift was almost imperceptible, but it sent a ripple through the watching crowd. A murmur rose, part astonishment, part relief, part disbelief, as Shaq extended one large hand, palm open, his face free of triumph, his offer as quiet and steady as his faith in the moment. Danielle took a faltering step forward, then another, her legs stiff as if they had forgotten how to carry her. When she reached him, her fingers hovered for a second in the space between them, hesitating, wavering, and then, with the softest, smallest motion, she placed her hand in his. Shaq helped her onto the bike, his movements careful, measured, respectful. He adjusted the seat, checked the controls, and handed her the helmet. The same helmet she had knocked aside hours earlier, now returned to her without a word of reproach. Danielle's hands shook as she placed it on her head, her breath quick and shallow as the reality of the moment settled in. With one smooth motion, Shaq mounted the bike in front of her, his broad shoulders steady as stone. He turned slightly, his voice reaching her through the soft hum of the engine. "Hold on." As the bike rumbled to life, Danielle hesitated again, her fingers hovering just above his back. She squeezed her eyes shut, took a breath, and then let her hands rest lightly against him. Not with certainty, not with comfort, but with the fragile first stirrings of surrender. The crowd parted slowly as the motorcycle rolled forward, the soft applause that broke out gentle, hesitant, almost reverent. Some clapped out of respect, others out of awe, and a few out of pure, unfiltered relief. Conversations rippled like waves. "Did you see that? I didn't think she'd do it. Shaq's a bigger man than I'll ever be." Shawnee tightened her arm around Maura, pressing a soft kiss to her daughter's hair, while Lucille let out a long, quiet sigh, the prayer on her lips finally settling into peace. As they rode back toward town, the bike cutting through the darkening streets, the man who had been robbed and the woman who had been broken became something no one could have predicted. Two people bound by a lesson, by a moment, by the quiet truth that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is offer your back to someone who's lost and trust them to hold on. The motorcycle moved smoothly through the cool night, its steady hum cutting through the hush that had settled over the town. Streetlights flickered on one by one, casting golden pools on the pavement, as Shaq guided the bike through familiar streets, Danielle clutching lightly at his back, her grip unsure but present. The crowd on the bridge was fading into memory now, but its weight lingered on both of them, an invisible thread stitched into their shoulders, hearts, and breaths as they moved forward. The journey back was not just a physical return but something deeper, something unspoken, reshaping the air between them. Danielle lifted her head slightly, her helmet pressing softly against Shaq's broad back, and saw the town through a lens she'd never imagined. She glimpsed the bakery, where she'd once scowled at the line of neighbors chatting happily outside, now seeing their faces lit with warmth instead of exclusion. She noticed the old gas station, where she'd filled her car with resentment more than fuel, the attendants waving now, as the motorcycle passed, their smiles free of suspicion or judgment. The town that had once felt like an enemy seemed to shimmer with a gentler light, and for the first time Danielle wondered how much of her isolation had been built by her own hands, brick by bitter brick. Shaq's mind drifted as they rode, his fingers loose on the grips, his shoulders relaxed in a way that surprised even him. He felt the wind on his face, cool and clean, and let it carry him back through the years, to the courts where he'd learned to rise above the noise, to the locker rooms where teammates leaned on him for steadiness, to the moments off camera when the world's judgment weighed heavy, and his mother's voice pulled him back to center. Lucille's words echoed now, soft and insistent. "Son, don't let their darkness put out your light. You were made to stand tall, but it's your kindness that'll lift people up." He'd carried those words through arenas and interviews, charity events and family dinners, through quiet moments of doubt when the world seemed too loud to bear. Tonight they had guided him again. They passed the church on the corner, its stained glass windows glowing softly, and Danielle felt her throat tighten unexpectedly. She remembered walking past it 100 times, sneering at the people streaming out in their Sunday best, resenting their easy smiles, their community, their sense of belonging. She'd told herself it was all fake, a performance, a game she wanted no part of. But now, with her arms wrapped lightly around the man she'd tried to tear down, she felt the first uneasy stirrings of something she couldn't name. Not guilt, exactly, but maybe the fragile beginnings of accountability. Shaq slowed the bike as they approached Main Street, the heart of the town, where shop windows gleamed and neighbors still lingered on sidewalks. Their conversations hushed as the motorcycle glided into view. People turned, some lifting their phones instinctively, others lowering them just as quickly, recognizing that this was not a moment for spectacle, but for witness. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, not the jeers Danielle had braced for, but something softer, something that felt like grace. From the corner of his eye, Shaq spotted Lucille near the bakery, her hands folded at her waist, her face a map of relief and quiet pride. Shawnee stood nearby with Mara and the other children, her eyes shining, her lips pressed into a thin, knowing smile. There was no victory dance here, no triumphant declaration, just the quiet affirmation that sometimes the hardest battles are the ones fought without foes, without fury, with nothing but an open hand and an unshakable heart. As they rolled to a stop near the coffee shop, Shaq cut the engine, the sudden silence settling over them like a soft blanket. Danielle's arms fell away from his back, her hands trembling slightly as she removed the helmet and set it carefully on the seat. For a long moment she sat frozen, eyes fixed on the ground, breath shallow in her chest. The weight of her past, the anger, the blame, the loneliness, pressed in on her, a sharp edge digging into her ribs. And yet alongside it, something unfamiliar stirred, something that felt suspiciously like the beginning of humility. Shaq dismounted first, rising to his full height, his presence unmistakable even in the quiet dusk. He turned to Danielle, offering his hand not as a command but as an invitation. She hesitated, every instinct screaming to flee, to reclaim what scraps of pride she could salvage, but then with a breathless, almost imperceptible motion, she placed her fingers in his. He helped her down with the same steady calm that had guided her through the night, and when she stood before him, her eyes glistening, he simply nodded once, the kind of nod that said everything without demanding a word in return. The townspeople watched, some wiping at their eyes, others clapping softly, a few murmuring to one another as if to confirm they were witnessing what they thought they were witnessing. Conversations bubbled up. Praise, astonishment, even debate. But Shaq paid them no mind. His gaze stayed on Danielle, his quiet presence the only thing anchoring her to this moment of reckoning. Danielle's voice, when it came, was barely more than a whisper. "I don't know how to fix any of this," she choked out, her throat raw, her eyes shining with unshed tears. Shaq gave a small, patient smile. "Start by walking forward." As Danielle took a tentative step toward the crowd, the town opened around her, not with fanfare or cheers, but with the simple, unadorned space that allowed a person to stumble, to try, to begin again. Lucille's eyes glistened with quiet approval. Shawnee placed a comforting hand on Myra's shoulder, and the streetlights flickered gently above, as if the town itself was exhaling a long-held breath. Shaq watched it all, his heart swelling with something deeper than pride, something closer to peace. He knew the road ahead would not be easy for Danielle, or for the town, or even for himself, but tonight had proven something he had long believed. True strength was not in domination, but in patience, not in conquest but in compassion. And as the last light faded behind the hills and the soft murmur of the crowd folded into the night, Shaq swung his leg back over the bike, settled into the seat, and rode slowly into the falling dark. Not just a basketball legend, but something far rarer, a man who had turned power into purpose, who had left a mark not with force but with grace. Months had passed, and the town had settled back into its familiar rhythms, the seasons shifting gently from summer's bright pulse to autumn's golden hush. Yet in small but unmistakable ways, something in the fabric of the town had changed, as if the night on the bridge had planted seeds in the soil that were now breaking through in unexpected places. The story of Danielle and Shaq no longer lived as gossip or scandal, no longer passed in whispers or raised brows. It had evolved into something the town carried with a strange quiet reverence, a tale told in coffee shops and on playground benches, in barber shops and at backyard cookouts. It had become a kind of legend, not for its spectacle but for the redemption it had left in its wake. At the heart of that redemption stood the community center, on Maple Street, a once faded brick building that Shaq had quietly funded for years, where kids found safe corners to laugh and learn, where families found a hand when they needed one most. And there on a crisp Saturday morning, under the shade of the old oak tree in the side yard, Danielle crouched beside a group of children, her hands smeared with grease, as she showed them how to fix the chain on a battered old bicycle. Her hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, her jeans scuffed and patched at the knees, and her face, once tight with resentment, was softened now by something gentler, an openness, a humility that had taken root in the long months of rebuilding. The kids surrounded her with wide eyes and excited chatter, their small fingers reaching eagerly to help as Danielle guided them with patience. She never would have recognized in herself before that night. For every stubborn bolt, every squeaky pedal, every burst of laughter when a tire popped unexpectedly, Danielle stayed steady, her voice calm, her smile easy. She had stepped into this space cautiously at first, unsure of her place, but the community and more remarkably, the children had offered her a kind of acceptance that bypassed judgment, as if they had intuitively known what she was still learning, that people are not fixed points, that hearts can be rewired if given the right tools and a little grace. From the edge of the park beneath the tall sycamore trees, Shaq watched with a quiet, steady gaze, his arms folded loosely across his chest. He said nothing, offered no public praise, drew no attention to himself, but his presence was unmistakable, not just in the breadth of his frame or the familiar silhouette that caught the eye, but in the atmosphere he carried, in the stillness that settled around him wherever he went. He watched Danielle laugh softly when a boy named Caleb sprayed himself with WD-40, saw her crouch to tie a little girl's shoelace without hesitation, saw her lift a newly repaired bike high over her head like a trophy before handing it back to its wide-eyed owner. Lucille sat nearby on a wooden bench, a basket of knitting in her lap, though her hands were still as her eyes rested on the scene. Shawnee stood beside her, one hand curled around a to-go coffee cup, the other tucked into her coat pocket, her eyes thoughtful as she took in the morning. They spoke in low tones, voices mingling with the autumn breeze. "It's the small things," Lucille murmured, her lips curving into the softest smile. "That's what makes the difference. A little kindness here, a little patience there. You string enough of them together, and you can pull a person right back from the edge." Shawnee nodded, her gaze never leaving Danielle. "I've seen him do it over and over," she said quietly, her voice warm with admiration. "But this one feels like a chapter none of us saw coming." Lucille's eyes glimmered, and she reached over to squeeze Shawnee's hand. "That's the beauty of it, honey. You never know what takes root until the season changes." As the morning wore on, more neighbors arrived, their children tumbling onto the playground, their voices ringing with the sharp, sweet sound of carefree joy. Parents greeted Danielle with nods and small smiles, their initial skepticism worn down by the simple fact of her showing up, again and again without fanfare or expectation. There was no press conference, no apology tour, no carefully staged redemption arc, only the quiet rhythm of days spent doing the work, of hands offered where once they had been clenched. Shaq's gaze lingered on Danielle a moment longer, then drifted across the park, to the kids racing up the slides, to the mural painted on the center's wall that read, "Better Together," to the elderly couple strolling slowly along the path with their fingers intertwined. He let the scene settle into his chest like a slow breath, felt the deep, grounding weight of it. This, not the trophies, not the headlines, not the roaring crowds, was the legacy he wanted to leave behind. A ripple of change, a reminder that grace could outlast anger, a space where people could walk in broken and leave carrying just a little more of themselves healed. As if sensing his gaze, Danielle glanced up from the bike she was fixing, her eyes meeting Shaq's across the distance. For a moment, the air between them held still, not tense, not uncertain, but filled with an understanding that ran deeper than words. She offered a small nod, a flicker of a smile that was equal parts gratitude and quiet resolve. Shaq nodded in return, his lips barely lifting at the corners, and then turned, his footsteps slow and easy as he made his way down the path toward the street. The camera of the moment, if it existed, would linger not on the crowd or the noise, but on his face, on the man who had chosen patience over punishment, who had stood steady in the storm, and trusted that somewhere in the wreckage, something good could still take root. His broad shoulders, once built to carry the weight of a franchise, now carried the quiet satisfaction of a man who had learned that real power wasn't measured in points or contracts, but in the lives you touched when no one was keeping score. As Shaq disappeared around the corner, the sound of children's laughter rippled after him, the clang of tools against metal, the soft murmur of neighbors rethreading the delicate fabric of trust. And on the bench, Lucille closed her eyes for a moment, her hands resting gently in her lap, the faintest whisper on her lips, "That's my boy." In the town storybook, this chapter would not be marked by spectacle or scandal, but by something far rarer, the quiet, enduring echo of grace. What would you do if grace, not anger, had the power to change everything? Let this story remind you. Real strength transforms. It doesn't destroy. Carry this lesson into your own streets, your own homes, where second chances wait to be given. Because sometimes the most unforgettable stories are the ones we choose to live out ourselves.